and it got into the media because of Audi. Who cares about Audi? They're a bunch of Germans. We know their track record, so they can't.
What?
Back to where they come from. Now, we got something to sell.
Bro, what was that? What was that? Oh, wait, here. How you going?
Hey, how you going? Is my mic sound okay?
Yeah, we fine. Let me just lower your volume. You're loud. Wait, speak again for me.
Test.
Yeah,
Testing.
yeah, perfect. Hey, man.
Okay.
How you going? Sorry, were you just watching the stream?
No, I wasn't. What happened?
Bro, Warren Mundane said some wild shit about Germany just on that video. Yeah, sorry. What's up? How can I help you?
Talking to me?
Yeah, what's up?
Okay.
What do you want to talk about?
So I have been on TikTok for a long time, and for the whole time I've been on TikTok, I get recommended your videos, and they're good rants. I like your tags. I think you've got a nice sort of view on things. You aren't too hard to either side. You're pretty reasonable.
Yeah. Thank
So
you.
I've always liked your takes, and coming to this Australia Day stuff, it's kind of annoying because people's takes on it are really awful. They're like, oh, these communists are taking over our country with Australia Day being cancelled, and there's really awful takes on it. But like me personally, I never really had that much of an interest in politics until things like lockdowns, things which sort of affected me really personally.
Yep.
And with Australia Day, it's an issue where because I've got I don't want to flex and say this, but I do have Aboriginal friends.
Yeah.
And I get to hear through their Instagram stories and stuff of a lot of problems in communities.
Mm-hmm.
The big ones being alcohol abuse. An even bigger one than that is the teen suicide rate, which I think has just eclipsed its highest record levels. And I sort of don't really see this ever break the news, especially not the rate that this Australia Day debate does. And I find that changing the date or calling it Invasion Day has now drowned out any ability to talk about these problems, such as the domestic violence and the alcohol abuse. And one doctor in the Kimberleys described the alcohol abuse as a modern day genocide, just with the amount of deaths that are coming through and the health problems. And so I was just wondering, obviously you want to change the date. I think that's what I've sort of gathered.
That's the thing. It's been my particular opinion is I don't have an answer, nor do I actually have a particularly strong opinion on whether or not the date needs to change on what we do about it. My whole thing is it just feels weird that we celebrate it on the first official settlement, which was the catalyst for everything else that happened. I think in an ideal world, from the content creators I've watched and the podcasts I've listened to and the Indigenous people I've heard speak about it, that they are always going to protest on this date because it was the start of the invasion. And I've heard people say the exact same thing you have said, that this debate every year, it drowns out any other conversations. And at the end of the day, debating whether or not the date needs to change or it needs to stay the same, that doesn't deal with any of the mental health issues or systemic difficulties they're facing or the alcohol or drugs or the suicide rate. But at the same time, there is an important conversation that needs to be had about history and truth-telling. And if we celebrate Australia Day on the start of an invasion and a genocide, what does that really say about how we consider our history?
I think the idea, this is going to be a bold take in a minute, but I think the idea of reconciliation and saying sorry, it's sort of it's an old record now. I think a lot of Australians aren't even was a statistic 50% of Australians have a parent who wasn't even born here or something like that.
Yeah, it's pretty major. Yeah, I don't know the exact number, but yeah.
The idea of when I was at school and I was taught about, what happened, what the whites did to the Aboriginals and history and, in a way, guilt tripping Australians. I think the idea of saying sorry now, it's almost as weird as celebrating Australia Day, celebrating a genocide. It's am I saying sorry for someone who, maybe shares the same blood as me, who did things that I don't agree with? Openly, I think most people say the massacres and things weren't good things, but why am I apologizing for that? And changing the date shifts the blame of all those things onto living Australians now who didn't agree with and didn't do any of those acts. And so I think the best way that Australia Day should be celebrated is we keep the date and we acknowledge these things in our history, but we acknowledge that we don't agree with them and that we as a nation can move on, we can heal. And the first step in doing that is talking about things like mental health and alcohol abuse over things that happened 200 years ago that no living Australian had anything to do with.
Sure. I'm just gonna ask you a couple questions. I like to stress every time I have these conversations. This is gonna sound like I'm trying to trap you in a corner because that's what everyone on the internet does, and it's the worst way to have conversations. What do you mean when you say you felt like learning about it was guilt tripping?
Well, as a kid, like you don't really understand many things in the world, and like fairy tales and children's books, they always have like good, evil, and an ending. And it feels like when they teach about, reconciliation, the way it's framed is that white people, the teacher's saying this, white people like yourselves came to Australia, they did awful things to people who were completely innocent, and you need to say sorry. Like you need to have reconciliation. And we haven't hit that yet. They say like, we haven't had reconciliation yet. And so it makes you feel, and it makes Australians feel, however childlike this may seem, that there is no reconciliation even possible because how can I apologize for something I didn't do? Like what more can I say? How many more Australian things do I need to give up to appease these people, like this reconciliation group?
Um, sure. I don't know. I don't know what our backgrounds were in the difference of where we grew up, but like when I was learning about this history, I was never told that I, as a white person, had to say sorry. Um, I can understand the argument about the difficulty with a child understanding the complexities of a genocide and like a settler colonial movement where there is this good and evil and it comes to an end. But I think that's the responsibility of parents and educators and community to teach it isn't that black and white. There is a reality to what we did. And when I say, and also to be clear, when I say we, to further it, I was born in America. My mother comes from Italian immigrants and my dad was a Jewish American. Okay. So I'm a citizen. I've been here since I was like 1 year old, but my ancestors weren't even wanted to do this, but I still say we because this land, not to get all mushy with it, because I don't want to go to all like the talking point place, but like this land, like many lands across the world, belonged to someone else. European settlers came in, they killed a bunch of people, massacred them, in my opinion, genocided them. I think there's good evidence for that. Stole a generation of children, and then throughout time, put in racist policies like the Northern Territory intervention that still impact people to this day. I don't think that doesn't mean we can't be proud of this country. I think Australia is a great country. We've done a great many things. And just because there is an imbalance in the way groups of people are treated doesn't mean this is a bad country. But at the same time, if we want to celebrate where we are now, I just don't think it makes sense to do it on the day that kickstarted all of the issues we're facing as well.
Okay. Can I just ask, like, you overwhelmingly think that the British settlement in Australia was a bad thing, like full stop?
Um, that I don't think that's a good or bad question because like without it, we wouldn't be here today, but it also resulted in like the slaughter of an indigenous people. I don't think settler colonialism was ever a morally good thing, but I think it's practically what got us here today.
Like a necessary part of history, you might say.
I don't know if I mean, it wasn't necessary. The world wouldn't have collapsed if it didn't happen, but it was necessary for us to get here today. If it had not happened, we would not be here today. For us to exist now, it inherently had to have happened.
That's right. So, like, when we have reconciliation, when we say sorry for these things, we're almost saying sorry for like our own existence. in that sense.
No, I don't agree that we're saying sorry for our own existence. What we're saying, and also to be clear, when we talk about reconciliation, I don't think people are literally asking for, oh, sorry this happened. The main focus of reconciliation is talking about recognizing the history and how we can prove the material conditions of people now. That's what reconciliation should be about.
I agree. It should be, but what was that Kevin Rudd speech ages ago, like with the dirt and all that? Like reconciliation. That's my problem. Is that reconciliation, changing the date, is too much about saying sorry and not enough, like you said, about making action now.
Well, hold on. To be clear, Kevin Rudd's statement, wasn't that saying sorry specifically for the stolen generation?
Look, I honestly don't know enough about it to give
Okay.
an answer to that, but maybe yes.
So, well, we can just, let me look it up because I haven't looked at this in a long time. I was right about that. So, on the 13th of February 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd made a formal apology to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, particularly to the stolen generation, whose lives have been blighted by past government policies of forced child removal and assimilation. I agree with you that if anyone is asking white people right now to be sorry for what happened, that doesn't make sense. It's kind of weird. But at least when I see governments talk about this, or community groups talk about this, or people who I actually value their opinion talk about this subject, they're not asking for white people to say sorry. They're asking for recognition of what occurred and a clear way to move forward to make this country better.
But it seems like would not like the storytelling that we have, and like at least my own experience of being taught it in schools, be what you're talking about, the recognition. Like it's not like anyone's denying that these things happened.
Well, maybe on my corner of the internet, but I got a lot of people in my comment section denying stuff happened, which is why I think it's important to kind of argue on this. But even still then, why? Okay, I guess here's a question. Do you have a particularly strong connection with the 26th of January?
Like myself personally,
Yeah.
outside of it being the Australia Day I've celebrated for my life, not really, no.
Okay, if it was the case that we were able to amicably find a new date, like Federation Day, when all the states came together, we want to do it where like we still get a public holiday and this, that, or the other, right? Because that's also what people care about. If there was another day that celebrated Australia coming together, and it moved from the 26th of January, we still got an Australia Day. Would you be okay with that?
But I think saying that implies that the other side would be happy to still call it Australia Day, and there wouldn't be some other event that fell on that same date that's just as bad as the settlement.
I will agree in the sense that there are always going to be people who disagree with having national pride whatsoever, because it was a settler colonial state. But I think I am of the belief that you can simultaneously recognize your history and be proud of where your country's gone. I just don't necessarily think that makes sense to do on the 26th. People are always going to be unhappy. But I think that almost any other day, maybe someone could change my mind on this. If someone knows a real horrible event that occurred in Australian history, it feels like almost any other day would be better to celebrate our national day than the moment the settlers arrived. That feels like a pretty bad one to do it.
Maybe, but I feel like just changing the date then was skipping the whole reconciliation thing and just ignoring it. Like if we made us I think the most Australian thing to do would be like have the same date, recognize those things that happened. Like oftentimes, you know how people will say like before a speech, like "Welcome to country."
Yep.
Like they're acknowledging that they're on stolen lands, and then they're getting on with their speech. So we can have an Australia Day where, we acknowledge everything that happened, and then we can have the day. Like it doesn't have to be a whole different day. Like the whole day can encapsulate everything from like reconciliation through to then our modern national pride.
I don't think it makes. I actually don't know if that's possible. I've gone back and forth of this, and talking to people and thinking about it. For most other days and events, I could maybe agree with you. But I think there is a core difference between having a difficult history to grapple with within the context of Australian pride versus the holiday literally being on the day that the First Fleet rose the flag and set the European settlement. I think that event is too big. And I agree with you. It can't be one or the other. I don't think changing Australia Day, like will skip reconciliation or mean it shouldn't be considered. On the totem pole of issues we want to be dealing with, Australia Day is probably relatively low, and it should mainly be about fixing some of the systemic injustices and difficulties we're having, and helping those who need it, right? But just, I actually don't know if you can move on from it. I don't know if the 26th makes it possible to allow us to recognize the history and have pride. Like, because what you're asking for there is, with the recognition of country to a speech, you're saying, hey, I recognize I'm on stolen land, never ceded, and now let's move forward with practically what's in front of us, because that happened over a numerous period of time. What we're asking for is, we recognize that on this day, the first fleet arrived, the first European settlement came to be, which led to a genocide and an invasion and everything else, but we're just going to move on from it. I don't think you can do that on today. I don't think it's possible.
But with that same point, you could argue there should be no Australia Day and there should be no Australia. Like,
no, I don't. That's not true.
because when you're saying, like, if you say it's impossible to recognize that historical fact and then have national pride, because you can't have the two coincide on the same date.
Yep.
As in symbolizing. Yeah, go on.
Because of the event. Like, okay, here's a comparable example. Do you think Germany should be able to have, like, a national day of pride?
Yes.
Do you think Hitler was a bad guy?
Definitely.
Do you think it would make sense to have Germany's national day of pride on the day Hitler rose to power?
Is that when their national holiday is, like, currently?
No, but that's what I'm saying. Like, we fundamentally understand that, like, oh, that date probably shouldn't be there, right? That would be a weird feeling.
Maybe, but this date, when you say it's a big catalyst for, like, the Aboriginal genocide and those awful things,
yeah,
it was also the catalyst for the creation of Australia, like a modern day country that is fair, that, you know, provides support to a lot of people worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of like the good and the bad. Like, yeah, it was definitely awful that those things happened because of that date, but that date also represents the creation of Australia.
Well, but that's why I wanted to check with you. So that's why I asked about the 26th. When I said, like, does the 26th have a particularly special data? You said not really, aside from it's what you've known. But so do you actually believe that, like, there is fundamentally something special worth celebrating about the arrival?
Well, if you can make the argument that the date's bad because it's the arrival, then I could also, on the other hand, make the claim that it's good because that's the creation of Australia, essentially, on that date, that catalyst.
You can make that argument, right? But I don't think it's a particularly strong argument. If you want to make that argument, you can. But I think when it comes down to, January 26th should be the day we celebrate Australia Day because it was the first European settlement in Australia. It was when the first Australians really kind of came to be, and that's something we should be proud of. And I say in response to that, well, that is true. It is the moment that the timeline began to get us where we are now. But at the same time, that was also the catalyst point for the invasion, for the genocide, for all of those other issues. And I think when we weigh it up, there are other days we should do it on, like Federation, when the states came together. Or for example, when I was doing research on it, on 1949, I think is when we passed the Citizenship and National Act, which was the first time they were kind of Australian citizens. Like, there are other important days. And I think on the cost versus reward of the 26th, it just doesn't feel right.
Maybe, but again, changing the date sort of sets the precedence that the important issues to deal with are ones like this and not those mental health issues and whatever. I think Jacinta Price came out. Let me just fact check myself before I say anything wrong.
It's all good. I'm not some crazy debate bro who needs you to have everything ready to go. Right? It's okay.
She, throughout the whole voice debate, and I think a little bit now on 2AW and some radio shows, she says that the idea of the Australian.
Oh, I lost you. Hopefully he comes back. He's lost another. God, freest debate win of my life, everybody. What's the chat saying? What else happened on that day? Because man, no one else can use it ever. It's okay. It try super hard not to say it, but it was on the 26th last year. I think so much of the debate is controlled by woke versus red pill people who have no interest in making meaningful changes when it distracts us from the real issues. Yeah, probably true to some degree. Would celebrating the end of World War II on D-Day be okay? 133,000 allies died that day. I don't know. We should hold Australia Day on the date we became a republic. Oh, why not? He is. A flag being raised isn't good enough reason to hate the day. It's not the flag being raised that's the reason. Where, have you died on me? Oh, man. Bro, his ping is like 5,000.
Aliens
Oh, you're back.
and hear me now? Oh, sorry, where I'm going? You
Wait. He's coming back and disappearing.
wait.
Are you back?
Yes, hopefully.
Welcome back to the world of the living.
So like the Five Eyes Asio just
Got you.
Okay, just into price. Yeah, so she was saying that like politicians and even some white Australians inadvertently are using this debate as maybe the word scapegoat to ignore like the very real problems happening right now. Because this government, same for the Liberals, and I think anyone in Australian politics, isn't able to stomach the fact that not only are they failing Australian families, but obviously these communities even more. And it maybe it's not on purpose, but it certainly seems like it's a lot easier to talk about things like the date than cost of living, alcohol, mental, all these other problems that we have.
I think a good government is able to do multiple things at once, and I think when these protests have been happening since like the 1930s, there is clearly like political incentive and will to change it if deemed necessary. I think what this comes down to is a really difficult internal debate between who we were versus who we want to be, and to what extent does progress and recognition of our past and doing everything we can to change ourselves warrant how proud of ourselves we should be, I guess. And I think we can be proud of ourselves. I think good things have happened in this country. I think there's been major change, even though there are major issues. But I think at the end of it all, you can't have your day of celebration, or it feels weird to have your day of celebration and your day of recognizing the change and how far you've come on the day that kickstarted the issues immediately following your like existence in a country. That doesn't make sense to me.
Do you think that the issues, or do you think that issues then still affects modern day Indigenous peoples, like the trauma or the?
Yeah, I would say so.
I don't know. This might be a different context, but like in America, you have the redlining.
Yep.
Things that like affect like them today, which some like African leaders claim is used as a tool to victimize like African Americans and to make them not get a step up because they should feel like a victim and like everything's stacked against them. Do you believe that in Australia, the same could be said, that we are not letting, but through debates like this, letting petty things like a date allow a sense of victimhood among Aboriginals and make them feel like they can't amount to anything because things like a date are keeping them down, and not, alcoholism and domestic violence, etc.?
Sure, the directions seem a little bit messed up there. Like, is it the case that maybe having these types of debates instills some level of like victimhood in people, or like takes away autonomy that makes it harder for them to like achieve things? Yeah, maybe, possibly. Like, I know The Voice did some like hard things and there were some debates around that, but I think like the bigger question is like, why are there such incredible degrees of like mental health difficulties, or like alcoholism or drug use, or difficulties within these communities, right? And it seems to be the case that comes from like the policies we put in place and the systemic issues that like impacted this group of people uniquely. And that having a day which is meant to celebrate all Australians, in which we're all a part of, on the day that the settlers and colonizers came to this country and put forward the first European settlement, feels like a weird way to include us all in that national identity. It feels really uncomfortable. And it's that weird dichotomy of I think there has to be a better way to celebrate our national pride.
Yeah, I think so. I agree with you. I do think that the symbolism of Australia Day, for some, definitely means like the start of that genocide and that catalyst for all those awful things. And I should have said this when you first asked me what Australia Day means to me, what Jan 26 means to me. But now that you've said all these things, I kind of want to make the argument that it's the catalyst for the creation of Australia, and so I should be proud of that. And
Um,
all the refugees that have come here from like Syria and like other places, they can be proud of that. They can be proud that at that point in history, a nation was born that was, besides for a certain few events that happened in those first 100 or 200 years, is now a very fair nation that all people are largely welcome.
Um, yeah, but it's like it's a celebration of the creation of a nation on like the backs of like the bodies of the indigenous population. That's the
But the history is violent. Like we look back now on those British things, in the lens of history and like the power of hindsight, and we can say those things were bad. But relatively speaking, base take incoming in 3 seconds. The British were quite progressive compared to other colonialist empires at the time. Like you had, I don't know if it's the Spanish or the Dutch, I don't know, some other colonizing empires. Their policy was just to like kill all the natives they found, whereas the British sort of, through the translation of history, made the mistake of things like stolen generations and the forced missionary camps to enact what looks like a genocide, but back then was, through their own writings, what seemed like their best ability to try and assimilate. Now we see that as quite a violent assimilation and you know contextually now a genocide. But back then they were being quite progressive versus other empires that would have otherwise found Australia.
Sure, we can get into like the nitty gritty of like the moral relativism of their actions, right? And whether or not they are morally culpable for what was normalized in that part of the world and what typically happened with like settler colonial states. But like at the end of the day, I'm going to apply my value of the date and whether I think it should be celebrated with like my current moral system. And according to my current moral system, celebrating Australia's National Day on the day that kickstarted all of those morally reprehensible actions isn't something I'm comfortable doing and something that I don't think is a particularly good thing to do. I think that we can say like we just want to move on from it. We've come far. We should be able to celebrate it. But like that's a pretty huge thing to move on from. I don't think that every single little thing needs to be sold before we're allowed to have some Australian pride and celebrate it. But one thing I'm damn sure of is it feels weird to have that day that we should be proud of it. We should simultaneously recognize the bad things we've done, but how far we've come as well, that we're celebrating that on the day that kickstarted all of these things. Normally, I don't like to do this because I think it's shitty, but I think this is one of those complicated issues where there isn't a particularly good answer. I actually don't know a date that would work. As I'm reading the chat and I'm just spitballing ideas, Federation wouldn't work either because there were horrible things that had to do with that as well. Yeah, and the issues surrounding like Indigenous Australians, like that doesn't make sense. There is a complicated moment of like when should we celebrate it? But I think just because we don't have another date in mind means that the whole debate should kind of be thrown out the window. And I don't know what your opinion was on The Voice, but it's kind of shitty to me that we had this opportunity to have truth-telling and treaty and a voice where we could have ironed these things out. We could have had an Indigenous advisory body sitting in Parliament and talking to people and ironing out what we want to do to simultaneously recognize our past but also celebrate how far we've come in a more respectable way. Should there be a public holiday in memoriam or in recognition of the original inhabitants of this land, the people who owned it before? But we don't get to have those conversations anymore, which is the difficult thing.
That's just opened the voice has just opened up the Pandora box right here. I was staunchly against that.
Sure.
Largely, and I know you agree with me on this next point, the fact that this government was so awful at like establishing any idea of what it's going to look like or how it's going to operate,
Yes.
and marketing that in such a way that Dutton couldn't just come in and say they're trying to take over the country, with all those things he started saying. But I was so firmly against The Voice because it's like it's the fact we have so many Aboriginals currently in Parliament, and they're very successful and they're good speakers, and they all have their amazing personalities. Um, but the idea that we play such a big pedestal on history and reconciliation in Australia, and that saying sorry for the past, I just again come back to the original point. Things like The Voice and things like changing the date make it seem like the only way forward in Australia. And let me just collect my words real quick. I've just built up to a big climax and just lost myself.
That's all good.
I'm just edging the audience. Pause. That the idea that Australia is sort of fundamentally racist to its core, and that we need to do such huge things like constitutional changes, like changing the date, to try and wash a little bit of that racism off. Um, Again, like so many Australians weren't even like born in Australia. Like all these issues and the magnification of them against things like just legislating, good funding for mental support and clinics for alcohol rehab versus $300 million in A Voice, and God knows how much more if it actually got through. It just seems everyone's priorities are so wrong, and just because the date is technically the kickstart of events which are bad in a historical lens, doesn't mean that we can't, on the other hand, recognize how far we've come. I just think like your core argument that
Oh, did I lose you
like
again? Oh,
that's
yeah,
the
yeah.
date, that's the date awful things begun, but I would say even better things also.
Um, well, I mean, depending on like better things we're at now because we exist, but the history is there. Okay, for the first part, you said like we're trying to like wash off the stain. I think the way with you're thinking about it is like the fundamental issue. There is no stain for us to wash off because that generation is dead. They're gone. That Australia is no longer where we are now. We are a fundamentally different Australia. There is no stain for us to wash off, right? That stain is left on the forefathers and the settlers and the convicts. However, that blood-soaked stain, right, is kind of seeping out still, and like we don't want it to infect anything else. That's where we're at now, that we recognize it was a horrible thing, and we don't want anything to impact people in a negative way like we ever have before, okay? So that's kind of the first thing with it, right? That stain isn't us anymore. That stain is a part of our history, and the country's history, but we aren't necessarily that, okay? We can benefit from those systems, which is why I have the feeling that it's uncomfortable to celebrate on this day when we are still benefiting from those systems and it's still negatively impacting people. But we are not that mistake. That we can untangle the individual from the mistakes Australia has made. Does that make sense to start with?
Okay. Yeah, just
Okay. Yeah.
on that train. Yeah, continue.
Okay. And then you said The Voice would cost too much money. I don't care to litigate that because that just holds another can of worms. I just think it would have been really good to have an advisory panel of Indigenous Australians who are able to come in and tell Parliament what they wanted. It would have helped us more. And that it was technically the kickstart. The issue is with it is if I'm able to separate my current Australian identity from the mistakes of the past, but still recognize those mistakes happen, and that isn't something that I want to be proud of in this country, that distancing myself from that date and creating a new national day of celebration, which which recognizes how far Australia has come, disentangled from those European settlers initially coming to this country and kickstarting the invasion and the genocide, I think that is a better thing to do. That is actually more in line with the Australian values I hold. That the values I hold now is different than what those initial settlers came to this country to do. And I think separating this is a positive thing to create that distance.
But like, it is a uniquely, like, all of the values and morals that you and I share are like likely quite like European English values and moralities, right? Where like a lot of other cultures in the world don't share anything like we do, to the level of like passion and equality that we strive for. And when you said distancing Australia Day from the British settlement, it's odd because like the reason we live in such a country as we do was founded on British like morals, values, ethics, and legal systems, etc.
Mm-hmm.
We can't separate ourselves from that history, and we shouldn't. Again, like, it seems the stalemate here is I'm saying we can recognize the good and the bad on that day, but you're saying it's too weird to try and do that and just too murky that we should just make a distinction. But I think it's more holistic to approach the good and the bad on the same day.
I think to be clear, I don't think it's possible to untangle the history of invasion and genocide from Australia. But
that's fine though. Like, I think most people recognize the two come hand in hand. Like,
sure,
yeah, we're such a great country with a shit past, but so is everyone else. Like,
but with that, we then have to think about how did we get to that point? That the past didn't happen. How do we get there? And it was from the moment of settlement. Settlement is what kickstarted that. It was that moment. And now we're not what we were. There are other issues still, but we're not what we were. We as Australian people don't hold those values. We can't disentangle our history from the day, but we can disentangle ourselves and our values for what Australia previously was. And with that national pride. To be prideful in Australia now does not mean to be prideful in the actions we've done. But I think the start to disentangling the Australia we were and the Australia we can be into both coexisting but not representing the same thing necessarily is not celebrating it on the start of an invasion or a genocide.
you can't. The events of British settlement led to, like, but how it sounds is you're separating the events of settlement. It led to a bad thing, but also a good thing, and we can sort of try to untangle them. You can't. They come together. Like, it's just history. Like, it's how it has to be presented. We can't. That's why it's important to view those things as coming together, because that's what's made the modern nation. We didn't have one without the other. Otherwise, we wouldn't be Australia. We couldn't have like modern day Australia, unfortunately, without the settlement and the things that came after.
Yeah, I agree. We could not be where we are now if those horrible actions didn't happen. But I don't think that then necessitates that the day we celebrate where we are now or how we got here has to be the kickstart for those horrible actions. It feels like we need to be able to kind of recognize our history, but I've said the word disentangle, but I agree with you somewhat that you can't ever really disentangle where you've come from. But there has to be a way, or I think there is a plausible way that we can recognize the bad we've done and how that's intrinsic to Australia's history, but then also recognize how different we are, and how proud we can be of where we are now. But it feels impossible to begin that journey if we don't say that, yes, this is what led us here. This was the first day the settlers arrived, but that arrival cannot be the thing that defines us.
I just had such a good rebuttal. Wow. I don't know who's letting that define them though. Like, no one's celebrating Australia Day. You know, oh, this is a good day of like genocide. Most people, it's like sinking beers. And for some Aboriginal leaders and for some white people, it's a day of genocide. But the thing about history and the thing about the events that happened is they didn't all just happen on the one day. Yes, it was the catalyst for them. Yes, it was arguably the beginning. But I might say to you, the beginning was when they first set sail, or when they first spotted the landmass. Like, yes, they sailed into the bay, they put the flag down. It's a symbolic start, but those events that carried out the genocides and everything carried out over the course of many years and decades. And so changing the date won't change the history. It doesn't really untangle anything because it's an inherent part of that, temporal ebb and flow that led to the modern day Australia and you and I sitting on this call together is those events that happened. And just changing the date, I don't think is symbolic enough to disentangle that history.
Sure. To be clear, it wasn't a symbolic start. It was the first fleet arriving. It was the real practical start. It was the first European settlement. I think that's a pretty defining factor. Like, that's why I think it's different.
A way of diverting attention.
Well, okay, but just to you can say it's diverting attention, but just to be clear, like, do you agree or disagree? It wasn't a symbolic start. It was a practical start. It's when the settlers arrived. That's what makes it different. It's not like that, because what was it? 1770 was the first time the flag was raised, and the first person was even way before that. But, like, this wasn't a symbolic start. This was the practical start. Do we agree on that?
But I could argue that.
Wait, are you cutting? Yes or yeah? Do we? I don't know if you're cutting out, your internet's messing with you or what. Wait, is he? I think he's cutting out on me. Yeah, ping again. That's rip.
Wait, let's try it. I think I just skipped my hotspot, so it should be.
Okay, there you go. You're back.
So, the date is for you symbolic of the beginning of like those genocides and.
Well, I guess it was practically the start of it. It was the first fleet arriving. It was the first, like, European settlement. It's not like a symbolic thing. It's like that's practically what kicked it off. Like, you can make the argument that the first ever action was them, like, leaving England, or it was the decision to not go on shore when they got here on, like, the 18th, but, like, or the 22nd, whatever it was. Like, it was a practical start. It was the first fleet arriving and setting the first settlement. Like, that's the point we're arguing. You said it was like a symbolic start, and there are other symbolic. It's a practical one.
But was it the practical start for the genocides, the bad things? Because I could say it's a practical start. It's a practical start for the good things, though. Like, there are probably events and dates that are more accurately described as the start of a genocide, the start of a massacre. This is just the start of, the ambiguous nature of, oh, well, this is, now under Her Majesty's control.
Which then led to what?
Well, then led to the birth of now what I'd say is the greatest country.
Yeah, and before that, like, what did the first fleet arriving and setting, like, the settlement do?
But things that, like, necessarily had to happen to birth this nation. I can't really see us overlooking all those events to now and saying, oh, skip those, just skip to now. Like, this is what we have to recognize, what we have now. No, all that history comes together. You can't separate it. And even a date alone doesn't separate it. Like, every date, 365 for the last 200 years, is somewhat connected to those events.
Yeah, but there has to be a way, or the only way it feels like we can practically move forward is there has to be a way to disentangle, like, Australia and what Australia's history was with, like, the current Australian identity. There has to be a way that we can simultaneously say, this is our history, it's intrinsic to how we got here, the country we have now was created on the backs of tens of thousands of dead people, right? That we did horrible, disgusting things, but also that isn't our Australian identity now. There has to be a way to do that.
We can do that on Jan 26th, and that's why it's so good, because you can say it symbolizes the creation of a good nation and the recognition of its bad history. Maybe you shouldn't separate the history and what it is today. Maybe those things must come hand in hand, because it shows that we're such a progressive society. We recognize the wrongdoings of the foundation and can criticize them while celebrating what we have now, which is a progressive, fair society.
How can you simultaneously, even if you want to if you want to do it on the same day, if let's say that's practically like there's no other solution, it has to be. How is it possible to simultaneously recognize and celebrate where we are now, but also recognize that a genocide occurred? How do those two
Because
things coexist?
doing what you're trying to do, which is trying to disentangle the events, I would say is worse
No,
because
no,
you're
no, no,
trying to
no. To be
ignore.
clear, no, no. To be exceptionally clear, as I try to say it, you cannot disentangle the events. The creation of Australia and the great country that got us here now, the great country we have now, and that genocide, you can never disentangle them. It's impossible. There's no way to do it. The history is baked in together.
Exactly.
However, we have to be able to disentangle the Australian, the Australian nationalism we have and pride and what it means to be an Australian from that. That Australia Day, and I would argue, because I'm not a big nationalist guy, Australia Day should be like a value of who we are as a people, what we value, that we value the ideas of acceptance and liberty and democracy and acceptance to all, but then we also have to recognize that who we are as a people now, that is not what we were when we birthed this country. That those two things have to be different. The Australian identity and Australian history, we have to be able to have these things coexist, but almost but constantly battle with that dichotomy. And I don't think you can do that on the 26th. I remember, yeah, go.
We're sort of getting into the idea that we're saying sorry for events that we took a part in.
No one has to say sorry. It's not about saying sorry, but it's about recognizing what this country was built on and what the 26th of January meant for the first inhabitants of this land. Yeah, go.
But for you, so what was the year? 1788.
Yeah.
I would say every single day of the year in 1788, a bad thing happened between a settler and an Aboriginal. And bad things would have continued to happen for many decades and years after the fact. So to try and separate history from our identity just by changing the date is I don't want to say infantile, but it's such an easy way out.
Yeah, it's not all or nothing. I want to be super clear on that. This isn't this will solve it all, or there's nothing else that we need to do, or this is the cat's-all solution. But if we can't even agree with the fundamental of the day we celebrate Australia's birth, the creation was also the kickstart or the catalyst for a genocide. How do we move forward with any of the truth-telling or treaty or anything to do with reconciliation? It's not about saying sorry. It's about recognizing history and moving forward and telling the truth about what happened in this country. How is it simultaneously we can accept the truth that we genocided the people who owned this land, we stole the land, we did whatever we wanted with them, we subjugated them, and they're still feeling the impacts of this today, but also at the same time, we're different now, guys. We should be so proud of it. The identity we have now as Australians is so fundamentally different than what the 26 represents. Even if you want to recognize, because at the same time, you can say it's the birthplace, but it's also the death of the Indigenous people. Those two things, you have to be able to do something with them. And I just don't think having it on the 26th makes sense.
So then you could just create a day of mourning on another day. Reconciliation Day, which we have.
But that still doesn't deal with the issue that the 26th is still the catalyst for the genocide. That's the issue. The fact it exists on the 26th at all is the issue.
But as I've said, every day of history for the last 200, bad things have happened to these people, and just changing the date isn't a band-aid for any of that. I think we have to appreciate the fact that, look, we've got this date now. We have reconciliation. We have so many things in place right now to try and forgive and to repair the damage that some people who weren't us a long time ago did,
Mm-hmm.
and that this day isn't a celebration of like genocide. I mean, again, for many, it's just drinking beer.
No, it's not that it's a celebration of genocide. It's that I don't think it's possible to celebrate how far your country has come on the anniversary of the catalyst for the genocide. That's the issue. Oh, sorry, give me 1 sec. Okay, for every single one of you right now who's throwing out the disease talking point or the genocide thing and it makes it more complicated, yes, it is true that the vast majority of people died because of diseases, okay? But when we look at things like the Frontier Wars or the Stolen Generation or the Northern Territory Intervention or everything like that, okay, it's pretty clear that genocide's happening, okay? We can understand those things. If someone wants to get into the nitty-gritty and like next week debate on the legitimacy of the term genocide for the indigenous population, it's a really wild thing to do. Settler colonial countries, pretty known for doing a genocide, okay? When you steal an entire generation of children and you want to whitewash them and you're fucking eliminating these people because you don't want them part, you want to bring them into white Australian society, remove their culture. Okay, you were saying?
Oh, hey, put a beat on that next time.
Okay.
That's good. You're like a good rapper.
Thanks.
Spitting bars.
Okay, I'm leaving at 8:30. So out of fairness, I'll make a statement and I'll give you the final word. I'm streaming every week. If we want to organize like a proper longer form debate, if you're interested in doing that, we can do that. Here's my overarching point: is that there has to be a way for, in my opinion, I think, to move forward when we have this like complicated national identity we're coming to terms with, is recognizing Australia's history and how we got here and the effects that that had on people, the catalyst for that slaughter, the massacres, the genocide, but also that we are different as a people now and there are values this country has that we should be proud of. That I'm not a particularly patriotic or kind of like nationalistic person, not in like a policy nationalism way, but like I care less about the country itself, but more the values the people hold. And I just don't think the values we have as Australians align with what the 26th of January like meant for the indigenous population and where it led us. I can understand the argument that whilst it was also the moment a bad thing happened, it was the start of the country we have now. But honestly, and maybe this is where we super fundamentally disagree, I don't think we should be proud of the way we started. I really don't. And I don't necessarily want to celebrate the day this country started, because I don't think we started particularly well. I think we have a lot of shameful history. We did a lot of horrible things. And I can be proud of where we are now without necessarily being proud of how we got there or how we got here. Yeah, I'll give you the final word.
I think you make a very strong argument. It's one that a lot of people would agree with you. Some people, likely with worse arguments, would agree with me. And maybe I think this only really comes down to is a public debate that shouldn't drown out other Aboriginal issues, and it should be something as formal as some kind of vote. Really, because there's that much of a divide about the issue. Maybe it has to come through our political infrastructure to actually decide.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, thanks for talking. If you want to talk again about anything, get in contact. Just because Australia Day passes doesn't mean we can't actually have an interesting conversation about it.
True.
Or just I hope to see you in the Discord. Okay. I want as many people talking as possible. If you know anyone who's especially got like more similar views to your own, because they're kind of at odds with a lot of what some people have, yeah, feel free to like invite them and everything. So good talking to you, man.
Perfect. All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Good
all the
debate
best.
and very, very good stream. Thank you.
Have a good one. I'm leaving you all. Again, we'll be here next Wednesday. I wish you all the best. Goodbye, everybody. Nice sentiment. Goodbye, everybody. Have a good one.